Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources, articles, research, and excerpt notes, and distill it down to the essential, fascinating, and most surprising nuggets of knowledge for you, the learner.
Hey, everyone!
Today, we are plunging straight into arguably the most dramatic and consequential period of the Second World War. We're talking about the spring and early summer of 1940.
Right. This was the moment. This was when that strange six-month lull, which everyone called the Phony War.
Yeah, that period right after the Nazi invasion of Poland.
Exactly. This is when that period just exploded into full, bloody, total conflict right across Western Europe.
Our mission today is a deep dive into those critical 3 months, April, May, and June of 1940. It's such a short, brutal timeline, but it led to this incredible turning point.
The forging of what we now call the Spirit of Dunkirk.
We're going to explore how Hitler's initial, devastatingly aggressive plans were first thwarted, and not through military might, because the military losses were just staggering.
No, it was something else entirely. It was a moral victory, a psychological one.
We're going to examine how this profound despair, the total loss of France, somehow managed to create this tiny, vital glimmer of hope.
A glimmer that saved Britain and gave the Allies the foundation to continue the fight.
And you really can't understand the sudden, intense shift without first looking north.
That's precisely right. If you look at the strategic timeline, the period after the first acts of Nazi aggression, like the conquest of Poland, it had been marked by waiting.
A lot of waiting.
The Allies spent months just hoping Hitler might pause or, that maybe diplomatic pressure could still avert a wider catastrophe.
But the aggression that started in Scandinavia in April and then immediately swept through the Low Countries in France, that was fundamentally different.
It signaled a profound, irreversible shift. The source material highlights this beautifully. The time for trying to avert war was just over. The Allied soldiers were now being sent, without hesitation, fully into battle.
And to understand that sudden shift, we have to start our analysis in the north.
Absolutely. The actions Hitler took in Scandinavia, though they seem sort of peripheral to the main Western Front, they set the crucial strategic stage for everything that followed.
So let's start there. The lure of the North and Chamberlain's dilemma. Why did Norway, of all places, suddenly become so critical for Hitler's war machine?
Well, on a map, it does seem a little distant from the main conflict line in France.
Right.
But our sources highlight its great strategic value for both sides. What Hitler was hunting for in those deep fjords was absolutely vital for the sheer logistics of Germany's capacity to wage total war.
Okay, so what was it?
The key asset wasn't military hardware, it was raw material, specifically iron ore.
Iron ore.
Sweden, a neutral country, was a major supplier of iron ore to Germany. And we learned from the sources that a stunning 90% of that Swedish iron ore.
90%.
90%. The ore that Germany desperately needed to fuel its steel mills, its tank production, its arms factories, it was all shipped year-round through the ice-free Norwegian port of Narvik.
Wow, so without that specific port.
Without that ore, Germany's industrial capacity and therefore its whole war effort would have choked. It's as simple as that.
So it's about resources, but the geography of Norway offered a lot more than just a transit port, didn't it?
It certainly did. Beyond the ore logistics, Norway's incredibly long coastline and its western ports offered these strategic deep-water bases that were perfectly situated for naval projection.
And the German High Command saw this early on.
Immediately. Grand Admiral Raeder, the head of the German Navy, he understood this perfectly. He had been arguing aggressively for the country's occupation as early as the autumn of 1939.
Right after the war began in Poland.
Yes, because these Norwegian ports provided perfect protected staging posts to launch U-boat attacks deep into the North Sea and the Atlantic.
Disrupting British supply lines.
Far more effectively than bases inside Germany's territorial waters ever could. So controlling Norway meant projecting naval power right into those vital convoy routes.
What's really remarkable here is the stark contrast in readiness. While Hitler's naval commanders are pushing for a preemptive invasion in late 1939, Britain, still led by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain,
Right.
is operating under this extreme policy of caution, almost denial, really, trying to minimize any military confrontation.
That cautious approach, policy of appeasement, it continued long past the invasion of Poland, and it was deeply rooted in the lingering horror of the First World War.
A national trauma.
Absolutely. Chamberlain, who'd been elected prime minister in 1937, was genuinely committed to peace because the memories of a bloody land war were still so fresh and potent in the national memory.
He didn't want to push the nation into another meat grinder.
Not unnecessarily, and we have to be clear, this wasn't based on any kind of political softness toward the Nazi regime. The source actually quotes him writing very candidly to his sister.
What did he say?
He expressed his personal view. On the whole, I hate Germans. His motive was purely pragmatic and, nationalistic. He feared for the very survival of Britain itself.
And his pragmatism, you argue, was rooted in a very sobering and, well, accurate assessment of Britain's weakness at that time.
It was just brutal reality. Britain simply lacked the necessary industrial infrastructure and, critically, the financial strength to win an arms race against Hitler's increasingly militarized state.
And America wasn't helping.
Not yet. To compound the challenge, America, traditionally Britain's key financial partner, remained isolationist and deeply reluctant to get involved under President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
So there was no money.
It meant Britain had insufficient funds to seriously redress the military balance. The only viable strategic choice Chamberlain felt he had was to delay confrontation, hoping to buy time.
Just buy time until they could somehow catch up, militarily or financially. Meanwhile, you have Churchill, who at this point is the First Lord of the Admiralty, and he's just consumed by frustration. He sees the strategic danger in this delay so clearly.
Churchill was convinced, absolutely convinced, that Hitler would exploit every single moment of hesitation, every suggestion he made to preemptively support Britain's Nordic neighbors or secure those vital sea lanes.
Vetoed.
Repeatedly outvoted by Chamberlain's cautious cabinet, the one limited plan he did manage to get approved was a very minor one. Just occupy Narvik and control the Swedish iron ore rail link.
But even that was blocked.
Immediately, because Norway and Sweden, desperate to remain neutral and fearing both Germany and the Soviet Union, they rejected any Allied collaboration. They were worried it would just drag them into the conflict.
Which brought Churchill to Operation Wilfred, his more aggressive alternative. The name itself, Wilfred, it sounds so deliberately misleading for such a drastic action.
It speaks volumes about the cabinet's internal divisions, doesn't it? They wanted plausible deniability.
So what was the plan?
Operation Wilfred was a classic, preemptive, high-risk Churchillian move. The core idea was simple but very effective. Mine Norwegian waters.
Just unilaterally mine them.
Yes. This would compel the German supply ships carrying that vital iron ore out into the open sea, where the waiting Royal Navy could sink them easily. Then, after crippling the supply route, Allied troops would occupy key Norwegian coastal towns.
It was a clear, calculated escalation designed to seize the strategic initiative from Hitler, and yet the government rejected it, repeatedly, giving Hitler the exact breathing space he needed.
And that hesitation proved fatal. Hitler used that entire Phony War period so wisely, finalizing his invasion plans for the West. By the time Operation Wilfred was finally approved and the British started mining Norwegian waters.
Which is April 8th, 1940?
Right. By then, it was already too late. Hitler's ships, his air force, his armies, they were all poised to invade not just Norway, but also Denmark, which he needed as a key staging post to control the Baltic and secure the air route to Norway.
This is where the pace of the war just suddenly accelerates. The speed and the complete disregard for international agreements. It was stunning. I mean, we're talking about Hitler tearing up a non-aggression pact with Denmark that was signed only 1 year earlier.
The invasion on April 9th, 1940 was a textbook blitz invasion of a neutral country, just meticulously planned.
When did it start?
At 4:15 in the morning, German forces marched into Denmark. The response was immediate and overwhelming because the intent was shock and terror.
They threatened to bomb Copenhagen.
A direct threat. Bomb the capital without warning. Facing that imminent destruction, the Danish government surrendered within 3 hours.
3 hours.
The occupation was so swift that many Danes woke up completely unaware that their country had been invaded and occupied overnight.
And at the same time, General Falkenhorst and the 21st Army Corps launched Operation Reserven against Norway. This wasn't a piecemeal invasion, it was a massive, simultaneous strike.
It was, targeting 6 major ports, including Oslo, Narvik, and Trondheim.
And it included a technological first that really demonstrated the ruthless innovation of the Wehrmacht.
Yes, the first paratrooper attack in history. German airborne forces parachuted directly into major cities and strategic military locations, bypassing all the traditional coastal and naval defenses.
Unbelievable.
Within a single day, just 24 hours, most of the strategically important Norwegian towns and cities were firmly in Nazi hands. The traditional concept of border defense was simply rendered obsolete by the speed and deployment of air power.
So the British Royal Navy, acting on Operation Wilfred, they arrived 2 days late, confirming all of Churchill's worst strategic fears.
Their efforts were completely futile because of the speed of the invasion. It was a painful confirmation that Chamberlain's caution had given Hitler an insurmountable first-mover advantage.
The Allied troops didn't even put up much of a fight.
Well, some British and French units landed briefly, but their efforts were disorganized, poorly supplied, and they were eventually withdrawn to fight elsewhere. The strategic loss of Norway and its vital iron ore route was inevitable. It cemented Hitler's northern flank.
Back in London, this failure created a profound political crisis. I mean, Churchill had been proved right repeatedly, while Chamberlain's passive strategy had clearly, disastrously failed.
The debate in the House of Commons over the Norway campaign was fraught with high emotion. It was a moment of true political drama where the fate of the nation really hung on a few words. The atmosphere was just poisonous.
And the final blow came from one of Chamberlain's own allies.
One of his closest allies, Leo Amory. He stood up and turned to history, using the exact damning words of Oliver Cromwell from centuries earlier to dissolve the Long Parliament.
What were the words?
He looked at Chamberlain and said, "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go."
That quote is legendary. It's hard to imagine a more public or brutal demand for a wartime leader to step down.
And Chamberlain resigned with dignity. Then came the challenge of finding a new leader, one who had the reputation and, frankly, the nerve to embrace total war.
The field of candidates was surprisingly thin.
It was. Anthony Eden, though capable and popular, was considered too young at 43 to command the necessary respect across the whole political spectrum in such a crisis.
And Viscount Halifax, Chamberlain's choice.
He was the preferred successor, but Halifax, understanding the immense burden and the need for a unified wartime coalition, he declined the role. He was unwilling to fight the war from the House of Lords.
So by a process of elimination.
By this political process of elimination, the only choice left with the necessary experience and political authority was Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty.
And he took office on May 10, 1940, completely unaware that this was the very day the next massive stage of Hitler's aggression, the invasion of the West, had begun.
Talk about a baptism by fire.
His reputation, his fearsome confidence, and his consistently correct analysis of Hitler. It immediately gave British morale this huge, much-needed boost.
Churchill understood the existential stakes immediately. His vow, delivered shortly after taking office, it set the tone for Britain's entire wartime mentality.
What was the vow?
It was defiant, passionate, and promised total commitment, he said. Every trace of Hitler's footsteps, every stain of his infected and corroding fingers will be sponged and purged, and if need be, blasted from the surface of the earth.
Wow.
So Adolf Hitler now knew he had a tougher, more determined, and absolutely unforgiving enemy than Chamberlain to contend with. The leadership shift was complete, just as the main invasion began.
So as Churchill takes the mantle on May 10th, the invasion of France begins. This was Hitler's grand ambition, wasn't it? The conquest of France, a nation he personally hated after his experiences in WWI.
It was to be the crowning glory of Nazi domination. And the German military machine, the Wehrmacht, they were incredibly prepared and methodical. They weren't just executing a sweeping advance. They had this highly elaborate, deceptive, and frankly, brilliant strategic plan.
Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow.
Yes. The genius of the plan, devised primarily by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was pure misdirection. Churchill later famously described this strategy as the sickle cut technique.
And the objective was total disaster for the Allies.
Absolute military disaster. Break the entire Allied line in two and trap the enemy forces, British, French, and Belgian, on the beaches of northern France.
Okay, let's break down the execution of that sickle cut, because it relied entirely on a massive feint and a deadly unexpected surprise. The Nazis used 3 coordinated army groups.
Yes, each with a very specific role designed to exploit Allied complacency. And they played perfectly on the Allies' expectation of fighting the last war.
Right, so first up was Army Group B.
Army Group B, led by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. This was the feint. They attacked immediately through the neutral Netherlands and northern Belgium.
What was their job?
Their job was crucial. They needed to be aggressive enough to convince the French and the British High Command that this was the main invasion axis, a repeat of the 1914 Schlieffen Plan sweep through Belgium.
And that was designed to draw the largest number of Allied troops northwards.
Exactly, into the Flanders Trap.
And the Allies, expecting a World War I rerun, would naturally rush their best armored divisions and the bulk of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF North.
Precisely. The BEF was Britain's small but highly effective professional corps. Their movement north was exactly what Hitler banked on.
Okay, so that's the feint. What about the second group?
Then you had Army Group C. This group handled the second function. They attacked France along the famously static defensive line, the Maginot Line.
A network of massive concrete fortifications.
Designed to make a frontal attack suicidal. Their role was simple. Keep the relatively large number of Allied forces along that border fully engaged and stationary.
So they couldn't reinforce the north or swing around to counter the real attack.
They were the anchor that held the Allied reserves in place.
And finally, the striking blade of the sickle, the true force, Army Group A.
Army Group A, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. This was the main thrust, the element of total surprise.
Yeah, it was their task.
This group was tasked with clearing a path through the thick, rugged, and heavily forested terrain of the Ardennes near Sedan.
An area the French High Command considered virtually impassable for large mechanized forces.
They did. The French believed the defenses here could be held by just a few second-tier, less-equipped divisions.
A fatal miscalculation.
Once through the Ardennes, Army Group A was to cross the River Meuse and execute the Blitzkrieg, a rapid, relentless push directly to the English Channel.
The strategic consequence of this plan was clear. Trapping the entire Allied force in Flanders Fields completely cut off from the rest of France.
It was a strategic masterpiece of deception because it relied entirely on the Allies fighting the war they expected based on the last conflict.
Hitler was confident.
Supremely confident. The source tells us that the night before the attack, he boasted to his staff, "Gentlemen, you are about to witness the most famous victory in history." He believed this operational plan was unstoppable.
And for the first week, he was absolutely correct. The Blitzkrieg began, and the first victims were the neutral Low Countries. The Netherlands fell with shocking speed.
They'd hoped the Nazis would bypass their main cities, relying on a system of flooded, low-level areas designed to slow an invasion for protection.
But that hope was immediately dashed.
Largely due to internal Nazi politics and rivalry. Hermann Goering, the commander of the Luftwaffe, was obsessed with securing the Western Dutch airfields.
Why?
He feared the British RAF might use them as forward operating bases to launch sustained attacks on the German industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley.
So he demanded a complete conquest of the Netherlands.
Not just a bypass. His vanity and his strategic fear fueled the aggressive timeline.
And the Dutch, despite fighting bravely, they were equipped for a different era of warfare.
They were relying heavily on WWI-era howitzers and antiquated machine guns against modern German panzers and sophisticated air support.
They fought hard, but the outcome was really predetermined.
Sadly, yes. The technological disparity and overwhelming force were just too vast, and Hitler was determined to crush any prolonged resistance. This determination culminated in the absolute atrocity committed in Rotterdam on May 14th.
This event signaled a horrifying new chapter in warfare in the West.
It really did.
Let's focus on that detail, because it set a terrifying precedent. The use of mass aerial bombardment as a psychological weapon against the civilian population.
As the German panzer divisions gathered near Rotterdam, the city was given a surrender ultimatum. And critically, while negotiations were underway.
While they were in the process of surrender.
Yes, while city officials were formally capitulating, waves of Goering's bombers darkened the skies, they intentionally did not wait.
The bombing was devastating.
It tore the historical heart out of Rotterdam, leaving much of the city center a flattened, desolate landscape. The human cost was immediate. Almost 1,000 people were killed, and a staggering 80,000 people were made instantly homeless.
It was an act of terror.
Absolutely. Designed to force capitulation across the entire country by demonstrating the consequences of continued resistance. With other major Dutch cities under threat of the same fate, the Netherlands had no choice.
They surrendered on May 14th.
The battle for Holland was over in 4 days. Queen Wilhelmina and the government fled to London to form a government in exile, but the Nazis had secured their strategically vital airfields.
The fall of Belgium proved tougher, at least initially, because of the famed Fort Eben email.
This fortress was considered virtually impregnable. It represented the peak of defensive engineering with huge guns and massive underground shelters.
But again, the Germans resorted to brilliantly unconventional tactics.
They did, showing their commitment to innovation over brute force. To neutralize this modern giant, which was manned by over 1,000 men, the Germans used specialized gliders.
Gliders.
Assault teams were landed via glider, silently and precisely, within the fortress perimeter itself, bypassing all the external defenses.
Incredible.
They used shape charges, a new type of explosive, to neutralize the massive gun turrets in minutes. Within hours, Nazi paratroopers and panzer divisions occupied the area.
And this rapid conquest of Eben Email allowed the feint to work perfectly.
It was the strategic trap, sprung flawlessly. The French and the BEF were convinced this breakthrough in Belgium was the main German attack, the expected path of the 1914 Schlieffen maneuver.
So they responded exactly as the Nazis had hoped.
Rushing their best reserves, the bulk of the BEF and France's best motorized divisions, into Belgium to try and form an unbroken line of resistance, they believed they were reinforcing the front.
But they're marching right into the sack,
leaving the actual main avenue of attack completely undefended.
While all this was happening down south, Army Group A was executing the main thrust through the Ardennes forest, completely unchallenged.
That's the real core story of Fall Gelb. The army pushing through the Ardennes comprised some of Germany's most formidable and dynamic generals, Ergen Rommel and, crucially, Heinz Guderian.
Guderian was the intellectual father of Blitzkrieg, this revolutionary form of warfare.
It really was.
We hear the term Blitzkrieg so often. What did Guderian's doctrine demand that was so different from the World War I mindset the Allies were still clinging to?
The difference was doctrinal speed and independence. Allied doctrine dictated that tanks existed to support the infantry. Any breakthrough had to be consolidated.
So you had to wait for the slower infantry and artillery to catch up.
Exactly. Before moving forward, Guderian completely inverted this. He believed the tank, the panzer division, was the decisive weapon of war.
And his doctrine.
It demanded the panzers pierce a small section of the front and then just proceed onward at the highest possible speed, disregarding what was happening on their flanks or whether their supply lines were fully secure.
So the goal wasn't just to make a hole, but to exploit the psychological shock by driving deep into the enemy rear, cutting communication, and causing panic.
Exactly. Guderian's philosophy was to drive for the objective, not the consolidation. If the tanks succeeded in piercing the line and sowing chaos, victory followed. The Allies just consistently failed to exploit their chances to stop them.
This allowed Hitler to remain in the ascendancy, with his troops appearing almost invincible. The next crucial defensive point, the line that absolutely had to hold, was the River Meuse. This 500-mile river was a critical natural barrier.
It was the last major geographical obstacle before the German panzers could break into the open French countryside.
And here's where we see the most significant failure of Allied generalship and strategic foresight.
It really is. General Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, he knew Army Group A was advancing, and he had what should have been a perfect opportunity to strike the long, vulnerable columns by air.
But he chose not to. Why the catastrophic reluctance to use his strategic bombers when they had the tactical advantage?
Gamelin was deeply conservative and risk-averse. He was reluctant to risk his strategic bombers so close to the German border, fearing high losses.
A classic World War I mentality.
Treating air power as a precious resource rather than an immediate offensive weapon, instead of ordering a rapid, devastating airstrike, he ordered reinforcement divisions to the Meuse sector via the comparatively slow means of night trains.
Night trains. That just speaks volumes about the complete lack of urgency.
And their understanding of the threat's speed.
So the French commanders genuinely believed they had days, maybe even a week, to set up defenses. They were convinced the Nazis wouldn't attempt to breach the Meuse until May 20th.
It was a grave and terminal underestimation of the speed and efficiency of the Blitzkrieg. Just 3 days after invading Belgium on May 13th, the German forces, spearheaded by Guderian's panzers, were already at the Meuse line.
Days ahead of Allied intelligence estimates.
While the panzers and troops began their push on land, Göring's Luftwaffe roared overhead, providing the concentrated, demoralizing air support that Gamelin had been too cautious to deploy.
We're talking about an unprecedented level of synchronized air and ground bombardment here, particularly at the Sedan crossing point.
Absolutely. The Luftwaffe flew almost 4,000 sorties that day, from 8 in the morning until dusk. It was the heaviest aerial bombardment the world had ever witnessed up to that point.
And the psychological pressure was immense.
The sheer terror of the Stuka dive bombers, coupled with the realization that the enemy had arrived days early. The French troops holding the Meuse line, often poorly trained B divisions, they were just shattered.
And the consequence was immediate and devastating to morale. It created a snowball effect of panic.
Allied morale plunged dramatically. Troops began abandoning their posts under the relentless assault. The panzers quickly pushed 5 miles into the French defenses by 7 p.m. that evening.
What made the collapse fatal were the false rumors.
Spreading wildly among the fleeing soldiers, tales that German tanks were already behind them, completely cutting them off. This panic was a psychological mistake that led to an immediate tactical disaster.
It caused the remaining troops to flee as well.
Leaving the Meuse crossing and the strategic bridges across it virtually unprotected.
So the next morning, German troops swept right over the river, and the Allied attempts to destroy those vital bridges failed miserably.
The Luftwaffe effectively protected their bridgehead. German fighter planes and anti-aircraft guns shot down around 90 Allied bombers in just one day.
The Germans called it the Day of the Fighters.
And the bridges remained intact, allowing the panzer divisions under Guderian and Rommel to range freely and quickly. The crucial difference here is that the panzers didn't consolidate, they just exploded outwards into the open French countryside.
This freedom led to the most reckless and successful phase of the advance, symbolized by Rommel's panzers, the Ghost Division.
It was Blitzkrieg at its most extreme, the independent action that terrified the German high command almost as much as it terrified the Allies.
They disregarded direct orders.
Both Rommel and Guderian disregarded explicit high command orders to stop and consolidate their bridgehead. Instead, they struck out in all directions, pushing so deep and so fast into France that even the German commanders in Berlin lost track of their exact location.
That operational secrecy, born of sheer velocity, earned them the nickname the Ghost Division. And the statistics of their success against the overwhelmed and demoralized French defenses are just staggering.
By May 17th, just 4 days after crossing the Meuse, Rommel's division had taken 10,000 Allied prisoners while suffering only 36 fatalities of his own men.
That level of tactical asymmetry just underscores how utterly ill-prepared the French were.
They lacked the mobile reserves and the communications to respond to a deep penetration thrust like that.
Panic had certainly set in across the Allied command structure, reaching the very top. On May 15th, French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud called Churchill
and delivered the agonizing, almost impossible news. We have been defeated, we are beaten, we have lost the battle.
Churchill immediately rushed to Paris the next day to assess the gravity of the situation firsthand. He asked the logical question: where was the strategic reserve that had saved Paris in 1914?
And Reynaud could only confess the terrifying reality. There is none. Every available French division had been committed to the northern feint or was locked down defending the static Maginot Line.
So the lack of preparedness wasn't just about equipment. It was doctrinal failure and years of political underinvestment.
It was a disastrous convergence. Since the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, France had demobilized, hoping Germany's warmongering days were over. After the Great Depression, they put off critical military rearmament.
So while Germany secretly invested heavily
in modern tanks, radio-equipped divisions, and air power, France was reliant on old-fashioned communications, lacking everything from modern tanks to light weapons and, crucially, a unified, aggressive, modern military leadership.
Amidst all this disaster, there was one small, vital glimmer of French resistance.
Led by General Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle, one of the few French officers who actually understood and advocated for modern mechanized warfare before the war began, hastily assembled forces for a limited counterattack.
He couldn't reverse the tide of the invasion.
No, his forces were too few and too late. But his actions were one of the few genuine positive successes for France during that terrible period. It earned him a promotion to brigadier general and critically established him as a figurehead for the Free French movement.
He realized the battle was lost in France, but the war was not over.
Exactly. It cemented his decision to continue the resistance from London.
Despite the incredible speed of the German advance, by May 17th, Guderian and Rommel were, ironically, in a very dangerous operational position.
They were low on fuel, their troops were exhausted from nonstop fighting, and their flanks were dangerously unprotected, having raced so far ahead of their supporting infantry.
This was the second, maybe even better, major opportunity for the French to attack. A perfect moment to counterslice the German armored thrust at its weakest point.
But once again, they failed to act. The Panzer Corps, which was in this really precarious state, was afforded the luxury of time.
Our sources note the troops were able to repair tanks, eat, sleep, and refresh themselves.
They even had time to shave and take a bath. The missed opportunity rests firmly with the failures of the French High Command and the panicked government.
And once refreshed, the panzers renewed their push intensely toward the coast. By May 20th, the situation for the Allied forces in the north became utterly disastrous.
They were completely encircled. The Allied forces, which included the majority of the BEF and France's most mobile divisions, were trapped by a German line stretching from Germany to the English Channel.
The northern pincer had closed.
The French government reacted by desperately trying to change leadership, sacking Chamberlain and replacing him with the elderly Major General Maxim Weygand on May 20th.
But it was far too late.
Weygand inherited an impossible strategic position. Lord Gort, the chief commanding officer of the BEF, recognizing the impending catastrophe,
That his entire force was about to be wiped out.
he ordered a desperate retreat toward the Channel on May 23rd. With Calais and Boulogne already blockaded by the advancing panzers, Dunkirk, just 6 miles from the Belgian border, became the last viable port.
The only escape route. The reality check for Britain was chilling. 300,000 British, French, and Belgian men were trapped, pinned between the advancing Germans and the sea.
And the British Navy initially feared they could only save around 45,000 men, meaning 250,000 active Allied servicemen were facing certain capture or death.
It was an existential brewing disaster. Britain stood to lose the entire professional core of its fighting army.
The very men it needed to defend the island itself. Losing those men would have made any further defense against Hitler almost impossible.
But then, 2 days before the Navy was due to arrive in force, an extraordinary, almost miraculous moment occurred.
The halt order.
Adolf Hitler issued an order for the panzer tanks, which were perfectly poised to attack the encircled troops, to halt their position. The mystery of the halt order.
It remains one of the most hotly debated, pivotal decisions of the entire war. We have 3 main theories drawn directly from the records of the German High Command's thinking at the time.
It wasn't a singular, clear decision.
No, it was a confused result of internal rivalries and conflicting strategic aims.
Let's break down the theories, because understanding this decision is key to understanding why Britain survived. Let's start with the most immediate personal theory, Göring's ego.
Göring's vanity played a huge role. He promised the Führer that the Luftwaffe alone could prevent any evacuation attempt.
He wanted the glory.
Desperately. He wanted the glory of destroying the entire British expeditionary force via air power, claiming the victory for himself and his air force, rather than letting the army's panzer divisions complete the job. His pride likely overrode sound military sense.
So, a tactical mistake born of bureaucratic rivalry and vanity. What about the strategic ground-level concerns?
That's the second key theory. Coming from Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who was leading Army Group A, he had legitimate tactical concerns.
Such as?
He warned Hitler that further deep panzer activity would result in unnecessary wear and tear on the tanks, necessitating an extended period for repairs and maintenance.
So he wanted to preserve them.
Keep them fresh for the crucial second stage of the Battle of France, the push south to seize Paris, which was codenamed Fall Gelb. The tanks were the spearhead, and he feared losing them.
And the third theory is perhaps the most politically fascinating.
Yes. That theory suggests that Hitler still hoped to negotiate a peace settlement with Britain after the total conquest of France.
He didn't want to completely annihilate the BEF.
He may have hoped that if he allowed a significant portion of their professional army to escape, a diplomatic settlement with London could be reached, allowing him to focus all his military energy on his ultimate ideological objective, Russia and the Eastern Front.
Whatever the true cocktail of reasons, vanity, logistics, or diplomacy, the halt order bought the Allies precious, vital time.
Time that was immediately and brilliantly utilized for Operation Dynamo. This was the mass evacuation plan, finalized by Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay in the deep underground tunnels beneath Dover Castle.
The logistical challenge was monumental.
But the response was one of unified national effort. While the Navy prepared its ships, a desperate message was broadcast across Britain on May 14th, requesting all owners of seaworthy civilian craft yachts, pleasure cruisers, fishing boats, register them with the Admiralty.
The little ships of Dunkirk.
This spontaneous civilian effort would become known instantly by that name.
And the little ships weren't just a romantic footnote in history, they were a vital operational necessity.
Exactly. This is the crucial detail. The shallow waters around Dunkirk meant that the larger, deeper draft naval vessels, destroyers, and troop ships could not actually reach the beaches. They would run aground.
So they had to anchor miles offshore.
And the smaller civilian craft, the fishing boats, the pleasure cruisers, they were absolutely essential for ferrying men from the shore, often wading out shoulder deep in the water to the waiting large ships.
The evacuation began on May 26th. The first crews arriving were astonished to find the German tanks nowhere to be seen.
But the respite was terrifyingly short-lived. The Nazi commanders soon realized the colossal mistake Hitler had made. On May 27th, Hitler ordered a full-scale air and land assault
to wipe out the remaining troops and sink the evacuation ships.
The air battle became crucial, with the Royal Air Force, the RAF flying constant, brutal sorties to protect the ships, and the soldiers huddled on the sand.
On the ground, the Allied soldiers knew they had to fight a relentless rearguard action to the last bullet.
Hundreds of British and French soldiers willingly sacrificed their lives to hold the shrinking perimeter and keep Hitler's ground troops away from the beaches. The situation was made even more desperate when, on May 28th, news arrived that Belgium had formally surrendered,
leaving the BEF's eastern flank dangerously exposed
to a direct, massive attack.
The initial struggle was terrifyingly slow. Only 8,000 soldiers saved in the first 48 hours.
Dunkirk was shrouded in clouds of black smoke from shelling and burning oil, but the soldiers dug in deeper. As news of the struggle reached Britain, more civilian boats, lifeboats, holiday steamers, yachts joined the mission spontaneously.
The sheer resilience was incredible.
Many of the little ships, once they delivered their first load of weary men to the UK, simply turned right around and sailed back to the battle-torn coast to make another run.
The numbers finally began to rise dramatically. May 29th saw 19,000 rescued, and the next day, a remarkable 47,000 men were saved.
And then the forces of nature seemed to intervene.
Yes. On the fourth day of Operation Dynamo, a thick fog descended and shrouded the entire channel and the French coast.
This grounded the Luftwaffe entirely. It became virtually impossible for Goering's planes to navigate and bomb the beaches and the ships, buying the Allies even more crucial time.
When the last boat finally left the shores of France on June 4th, the final count was hailed by Churchill as nothing short of a miracle of deliverance.
Over 330,000 British, French, and Belgian men had been rescued. Considering the catastrophic circumstances, the cost was astonishingly low in terms of human life. Only 2,000 Allied servicemen were lost on the beaches.
Even Rommel praised their resistance.
He did. He begrudgingly praised the staunch resistance of the Allied forces. For Nazi Germany, the failure to swiftly capture Dunkirk and destroy the entire BEF was perhaps the biggest single operational mistake they would make in the Western theater of war.
While Britain rejoiced, Churchill, with his feet firmly planted in reality, was quick to caution the public. He hailed it as a miracle of deliverance, but immediately warned the nation.
We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations.
And he was absolutely correct. The consequences of the evacuation were severe.
Valuable heavy artillery and weapons, everything from tanks and trucks to light weaponry, were lost and abandoned on the beaches. This immediately resulted in Britain becoming even more dependent on the United States.
And many thousands of Allied soldiers who couldn't reach Dunkirk were left behind.
They became prisoners of war.
For France, the mood was one of understandable bleakness and despair. General Weygand's position was impossible. They had lost their strongest and most modern forces.
Many French leaders, seeing the escape of the BEF, openly viewed Dunkirk as an abandonment by the British. They felt utterly isolated and exposed.
Hitler wasted no time capitalizing on this vulnerability. Just one day after the last ship left Dunkirk on June 5th, the German offensive codenamed Fall Rot was renewed.
This time pushing rapidly toward Paris.
And without the support of the British Air Force, which had been recalled to defend Britain, the French air resistance collapsed.
Almost immediately, giving Germany total air supremacy over the remaining French territory.
The outcome of Fall Rot was sealed quickly.
The French government, realizing the inevitable, fled, declaring Paris an open city to spare the historic capital from destruction. On June 14th, the Wehrmacht marched triumphantly into the French capital.
For Hitler, this was the crowning glory, the defining moment of vengeance he had waited for. And the humiliation of France was made intensely symbolic, orchestrated by Hitler himself in a stunning act of historical revenge.
Yes. Paul Renault resigned, succeeded by Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of WWI, who immediately requested an armistice.
And Hitler, still seething over Germany's humiliation after the 1918 armistice, sought a powerful physical vengeance.
He had the original train carriage, where the 1918 document had been signed, physically removed from a French museum and meticulously placed in the exact same spot in the Compiègne forest.
Unbelievable.
On June 22nd, Hitler sat in the chair where Marshal Frosch had completed Germany's surrender 2 decades earlier. He listened disdainfully to the preamble, and then, having made a symbolic point, left the rest of the proceedings to his chief of staff.
It was total symbolic dominance designed to scar the French psyche.
And France was subsequently split. The occupied zone in the industrial north and west, and the nominally independent Vichy government in the south, led by Pétain, who chose collaboration.
To make matters worse for Britain, Benito Mussolini's fascist Italy, eager to join the spoils of victory, declared war on France and Britain on June 10th.
This immediately opened a new, potentially dangerous theater of operations, putting pressure on British troops in North Africa and the Mediterranean.
So by the end of June 1940, Britain was in a grave and isolated situation. They stood virtually alone, surrounded by the Axis powers.
And with Stalin's massive Red Army dominating the East.
Despite these dire military and geopolitical odds, Dunkirk had instilled one crucial psychological resource that was now spread throughout the nation.
Determination and hope. Churchill's miracle of deliverance ensured that the British people, having witnessed such mass civilian and military determination, now believed fundamentally that Hitler could be defeated if they pulled together.
The belief was forged that resistance was possible. The Battle of France was indeed over, and as Churchill famously declared,
"The Battle of Britain is about to begin."
the spirit forged in despair had given them the resolve they needed to face the impending air war.
That is the ultimate crucial significance of Hitler's halt order and Operation Dynamo. It wasn't a military victory. The Allies lost virtually all their equipment and territory.
But the spirit of Dunkirk,
That incredible determination and mass civilian effort, it provided the essential morale boost and, critically, the core fighting force, the 330,000 trained men that saved Britain from the icy grasp of the Third Reich and truly changed the ultimate course of history.
So what does this all mean for the immediate next phase of the war? The 330,000 soldiers rescued were weary, they were without their weapons, but their survival ensured Britain had the necessary men to defend their island when Hitler's invasion plans Operation Sea Lion arrived later that year. Our provocative closing thought for you, the learner, is this. Without Operation Dynamo, and with those 300,000 professional men captured, what resources, human or otherwise, would Churchill have had left to feed into the Battle of Britain?
Would the RAF have had the ground support, the command structure, or even the public morale necessary to win the air war at all? A sobering thought indeed about the slender thread upon which history often hangs.
It certainly is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the defining months of the spring of 1940. If you are passionate about exploring these incredible historical narratives and you want to support the incredible archival work and research that makes these deep dives possible, we invite you to check out the War Stories merch.
It's a great way to support the work we do here.
You can find all the details and shop links right in the description below. Keep learning, keep questioning, and we'll catch you next time for the next deep dive.